Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 15 waiver wire targets for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're going to be talking about prospects at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defensive positions going into Week 15. And if you are here and playing in Week 15, I want to, of course, congratulate you for making your fantasy football playoffs. It is not an easy task to go ahead and fight through the marathon of injuries, of bye weeks, of terrible situations in regards to players not showing up on a given week, which many did not show up this last weekend anyway. But either way, congratulations for those of you who have made it this far. The entire purpose of getting to the playoffs is to go ahead and try to upset special or perhaps maintain the top seeding, win a 2021 fantasy football championship, and that's exactly what we're going to go ahead and help you do by presenting some waiver wire targets who are currently rostered in less than 40% of leagues, who may be available in your league to pick up, help you win not only this week, but for weeks to go ahead and help you guys win a championship. So before we begin today's video and get into the content, I want to go ahead and thank you guys for supporting the channel. We are very close to surpassing 58,000 subscribers, so if you guys have not yet already, be sure to subscribe. Of course, we're going to make fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2021 season, even until the end of Week 18 and going into the NFL playoffs, because there are some fantasy football leagues to participate in for those of you who are interested. And for those of you who are trying to find those NFL playoff fantasy leagues, you can go ahead and travel over to Underdog Fantasy. There's a link down in the description of the video. If you go ahead and sign up today using promo code Andrew, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. You can go ahead and draft a best ball team today for the NFL playoffs. There's a huge prize pool for those of you who are interested, not only in playing the weekly contest, the weekly pick'ems, but also for things outside of the fantasy football season. Again, the season's almost over, so you want to get as many leagues as possible, draft as many teams as you possibly can to continue to enjoy fantasy football even when we're in the NFL playoffs. All right, outside of that, let's go ahead and let's begin by talking about our Week 15 waiver wire targets. Like I mentioned last week, the primary kind of factor or variable that gives a player more value on a weekly basis than they typically would is injuries. And I wanted to go ahead and refer to some of the injuries that took place yesterday on Sunday and may affect this upcoming week's matchups. Specifically, Austin Ekeler left the game with an ankle injury. He does play on Thursday Night Football against the Kansas City Chiefs. Head coach Brandon Staley of the Los Angeles Chargers did say that he is fine and should be able to play. But of course, we'll talk about his respective backups because you always want to have handcuffs on roster just in case of a scenario as such occurring. Outside of that, Terry McLaurin, he did sustain a concussion in the game against the Dallas Cowboys. We'll have to keep that monitored as to whether or not he's going to play and whether or not any of the other receiving prospects in that given offense are valuable enough to keep on roster. Moving on, Lamar Jackson, of course, left with an ankle injury. Tyler Huntley came in and certainly did the best he could possibly do. He got Mark Andrews involved, he got Rashod Bateman involved, and he certainly was able to produce valuable fantasy assets for us, regardless of the fact that there was a quarterback change. From what I heard from John Harbaugh today, of course, there is a scenario where Lamar Jackson is expected to play. It is not a high ankle sprain, so he should be ready for Week 15. DJ Moore did tweak his knee. We're going to have to keep an eye on that. Of course, Robby Anderson had himself a big week, and the Miami Dolphins backfield is currently all on injured reserve and are currently on the virus list. So Myles Gaskin, Phillip Lindsay, Salvon Ahmed, we do not know whether or not any of them are going to play, much less this week. We're just trying to wait and see. Patrick Laird, the next best running back in that lineup, he is on the injured reserve with an MCL injury. So that entire backfield is completely demolished. They may have to go out and sign someone off the waiver wire. We're going to keep our eye going to track on that, whether or not we're going to find someone of value there, because they do play against the New York Jets, and that's typically a matchup we want to take advantage of. All right, another thing that I wanted to mention before we get into the running back conversation. There's a little strategy that I like to go ahead and use every single week throughout the fantasy season, and I thought I might as well go ahead and just explain it to you guys now that we're in the playoffs. Again, there aren't that many incredible fantasy prospects, though there are a couple that you want to have on roster and use your number one waiver for this week. I wanted to go ahead and explain a strategy that I use in almost all of my leagues. If in fact you do play in a Yahoo or ESPN, NFL.com league, typically what you'll find is, okay, like let's say for example my main league, the waivers run at 1:15 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. But about 30 minutes before the waivers run and all the transactions that were put in before the waiver wire, before those are enacted, you have the ability to go and pick up players that haven't been waiver claimed. Technically, the plus marker on players like on Yahoo would be green instead of grayed out because nobody put a claim in on them. So what I went ahead and did, obviously, besides the fact that I know many of us go ahead and before waivers run, we go and we check out who didn't have a waiver claimed on them, perhaps pick them up without taking a penalty of your waiver wire standing. But what I've done in the last couple weeks is, in order to prevent other people in my leagues from going and cleaning up the waiver wire when I'm asleep, I've gone ahead and just put in 50 waivers every single week and locked up every single player so no one can go ahead and do that. Now, it depends on what kind of league you're playing in, but again, you can go ahead and you can put in 50 waivers, especially if you don't care about your priority, or you can go ahead and sneak through the night, wait at 1:15 or about 12:45 and steal all those players off of the waivers and find yourself some value. But either way, I just wanted to share that information with you guys. You can either go and sneak and grab players that hadn't had a waiver placed on them, or you can go ahead and put in 50 claims on every single player that is possibly available in order to make sure that no one in your league is able to pull something like that off in the dark of night. Okay, either way, just wanted to mention that. Now that we've covered that, let's go ahead and let's begin by talking about the running back position for Week 15, beginning with Rashaad Penny at the running back position. Of course, Rashaad Penny is coming off of an incredible week of 137 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 26.3 fantasy points. This backfield hasn't had stability since the injury that occurred to Chris Carson this season. They've had an unbelievable amount of turnover, whether it was with Alex Collins going to DJ Dallas, going to Travis Homer, going to Adrian Peterson, going to Rashaad Penny, back to Alex Collins, back now to Rashaad Penny as the starting running back of the Seattle Seahawks. A former first-round pick for this team is perhaps in line for some great value ahead. The performance he just had against the Houston Texans was incredible, but he's going to have some tougher matchups ahead. Of course, the Los Angeles Rams in Week 15, but nonetheless, anytime you're able to find a starting running back off the waiver wire, you want to go ahead and invest accordingly and find some value out of it. Again, we've been waiting years to see if Rashaad Penny could stay healthy and in our lineups and be a relevant fantasy piece. Hopefully, it's going to continue. Moving on, our number 2 running back option is Craig Reynolds. Though many of us thought that Jefferson or perhaps Godwin of the Detroit Lions backfield were going to step up and be the number 1-2 combo this week, unfortunately, some guy that's currently 1% roster came out of nowhere. Craig Reynolds, 11 carries for 83 yards, 2 catches for 16, 10.9 fantasy points. Of course, in the absence of DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams. I'm hearing some rumors that there is a potential in which DeAndre Swift gets shut down for the rest of the season. If that's going to be the case, of course, Jamal Williams will have value. But until he returns, Craig Reynolds is going to have the entire lion's share of this backfield, literally. And, there could be a lot of value to be had here, especially considering how much the Detroit Lions want to actively use their running backs, not only in the running game, but in the passing game. Craig Reynolds, not a bad option going forward. Moving on to a couple handcuff options that may be of value this week. We're talking about Philadelphia Eagles running backs coming off the bye week. Again, there are no longer any bye weeks plaguing our teams. So Jordan Howard and Boston Scott are my number 3 and 4 because the last time we saw Miles Sanders, he left the game with an ankle injury. If that injury is going to potentially impede on him, succeeding and or playing this upcoming week, then by all means, Jordan Howard and Boston Scott, they have proven that they have a lot of value in fantasy. Since week 8, when the Philadelphia Eagles took on the Detroit Lions, this team has been humming in terms of running the ball. Whether it has been with Jalen Hurts or just running the ball with their respective running backs. Respective running backs since week 8 through 13 have been running the ball 30.5 times per game. I mean, those kind of attempts are just unheard of in the National Football League. But as of late, Jordan Howard, he's been averaging nearly 13 rushing attempts per game, 68.5 rushing yards, 0.75 total rushing touchdowns per game in the last 4 games that he has played with the Philadelphia Eagles, averaging 11.35 fantasy points per game. While Boston Scott, averaging 11 rushing attempts per game, 52 rushing yards per game, and 0.6 rushing touchdowns per game in the couple contests that he has recently played with him, averaging 9.7 fantasy points per game. Both these guys in the same backfield could very easily be 10 plus points on a given week. And if in fact Miles Sanders is not going to participate in this weekend's contest, then of course I think Jordan Howard, Boston Scott can get the job done on the ground and find themselves a lot of value. These 2 running backs could fill in for the weeks ahead. Moving on to 2 other running backs, handcuffs in their own right. We have Justin Jackson and Joshua Kelley. The reason why I wanted to mention them is, of course, what I mentioned earlier. Austin Eckler is dealing with an injury. I know Coach Brandon Staley did mention that he's going to be fine and should be able to play on Thursday night. But if, in fact, we get into a scenario and perhaps Austin Eckler is going to miss our first week of our playoffs, you better hope you have a bye week, because if that's not the case, then we're going to be in a scenario in which we may have to start one of these 2 running backs, perhaps even both in some scenarios. Of course, this last week against the New York Giants, both Both had plus 10 touches. Both played over 28% of the offensive snaps and got themselves about 4.7 and 4.3 fantasy points. Is that great overall production? Absolutely not, but they are widely available. In my current opinion, no one can really fill in the shoes of Austin Ekeler. Austin Ekeler is a one-of-a-kind running back, being able to get it done on the ground through the air. So in order to fill in his potential absence, they're going to need an entire running back by committee situation, by maybe even getting Larry Roundtree in this scenario. But for right now, these are the best two options in terms of filling in and trying to recoup any value if, in fact, Austin Ekeler is going to miss time. Either way, those are our top 6 running back targets for this week. We'll go ahead and move on and talk about the wide receiver position, beginning with KJ Osborn. Of course, KJ Osborn, 15.8 half PPR fantasy points, 9 targets, 3 catches, 83 yards, and a huge touchdown late in that game against the Pittsburgh Steelers last Thursday night. Of course, he's currently rostered in 38% of leagues. Many of you went ahead and acquired his services via the waiver wire last week. And hopefully, if he is still available in your league, you'll have a chance to go ahead and pick him up. Probably not available in majority of leagues, but nonetheless, wanted to go ahead and shout him out because he has been playing well. And I do not expect Adam Thielen to return as early as this week. Probably take another week until he's going to recover from his high ankle sprain. Moving on, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. Luckily, Amon-Ra St. Brown pretty much picked up where he left off the last time we saw him against the Minnesota Vikings, where he had 12 targets in his second consecutive week. 12 targets, 8 catches, 73 yards against a much more difficult matchup against the Denver Broncos secondary. He's currently only rostered in 12% of leagues, coming off of back-to-back weeks of double-digit fantasy points. As long as Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to continue to see the targets from Jared Goff, then by all means, in a half PPR, full PPR, the value is going to continue to sustain itself over the coming weeks. Their upcoming matchups aren't difficult enough to make me want to avoid Amon-Ra St. Brown. In fact, I want to go ahead, have him on roster, and that is why he's our number 2. Moving on to number 3, Gabriel Davis. Gabriel Davis had a surprising 83% snap share of the offense against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. As it currently stands, it looks like Emmanuel Sanders is dealing with some injuries, and it is probably going to be Gabriel Davis from here on out being the number 3 wide receiver. And luckily for him, in the last couple weeks, he has scored some touchdowns. He's found himself a lot of value and is becoming one of their favorite targets down the stretch. Of course, without much of a running game, and the only person really running the ball actively enough in that offense, Josh Allen, he's obviously dealing with himself a little bit of a turf toe injury. They're going to have to continue to pass the ball. Gabriel Davis is only rostered in 3% of leagues. Of course, the Gabriel Davis truthers are going to come out and explain to you guys he is an extremely talented wide receiver. We have seen splashes of him last year, and hopefully he'll have the opportunity to take the job from Emmanuel Sanders here on forth, because he is a very talented player that could give a lot of fantasy value in a very high-powered offense. Moving on to our number 4 option, we have DeVante Parker coming off of the bye week again, with Will Fuller once again not being mentioned in any of the practice reports. It truly does seem to me that he is done for the season. So DeVante Parker going against the Jets, New Orleans Saints, and Tennessee Titans, 3 green matchups over the last 6 weeks, could very easily bode well for him. He's currently rostered in 45% of leagues, but if in fact he's potentially available for you, why not go ahead and pick up DeVante Parker, find value in an offense that, again, may not have a backfield this week and will probably have to throw the ball 30 plus times against the New York Jets secondary. Moving on to our number 5 option, we have Rashod Bateman of the Baltimore Ravens. Though we thought Rashod Bateman was a potential drop option, currently rostered in only 36% of leagues. But fortunately for those of you who stuck through the entire, inconsistencies of Rashod Bateman, you benefited from the fact that he had 7 catches for 103 yards, was 1 yard short of a touchdown. Unfortunately, Latavius Murray comes in the next play, punches it in, steals the 6 points, but he could have had himself a 20-point game there. Nonetheless, even with a backup quarterback, I think he's a great option going forward if the offense and these matchups start to line up for Rashod Bateman. He continues to see that kind of volume of targets. Maybe it was because of the backup quarterback, but we'll have to wait and see just exactly what kind of Rashod Bateman opportunity we have going ahead. Moving on to our final of the top 6 options, we have Robby Anderson with DJ Moore dealing with a bit of a knee injury. There is a possibility in which Robby Anderson steps up as the number 1 wide receiver option of this team, regardless of who's at the quarterback position, whether it's Cam or even PJ Walker and Sam Darnold, who could return from the injured reserve. I think, of course, yes, their upcoming schedule this week against the Buffalo Bills isn't the easiest, but there could be value for Robby Anderson to have if in fact he is the only receiving option out wide to acquire a relevant amount of targets that may lead to his overall success. Let's move on to the second half of the wide receiver conversation. Again, we're talking about 12 wide receivers today. Beginning, we have number 7, Donovan Peoples-Jones. He did have himself a great game yesterday against the Baltimore Ravens secondary. Of course, without Marlon Humphreys, it was going to be a little bit of an easier day for Donovan Peoples-Jones. 7 targets, 5 catches, 90 yards, 11.5 fantasy points. Currently only rostered in 10% of leagues. If the Cleveland Browns, I know that their matchup this week against the Las Vegas Raiders isn't the easiest. Of course, Casey Hayward will have the responsibility of covering Donovan Peoples-Jones, which of course leaves Donovan Peoples-Jones probably outside of my top 36 rankings. I think in weeks ahead, he could continue to build momentum here, find some value, and be a decent wide receiver option. Moving on to Kendrick Bourne coming off of the bye week, taking on the Indianapolis Colts secondary. Again, it is one of the easier matchups. And of course, we know that the Indianapolis Colts are really good in terms of stopping the run. So if in fact the receiving option is going to step up this week, I think Kendrick Bourne will certainly be able to do so. Week 16, they play the Bills again. Of course, we know what happened last time. Kendrick Bourne had a 0 goose egg along with all other wide receivers for the New England Patriots. So that's going to be tough to trust in week 16. But for right now, week 15 could be of service to us. Going on to number 9, we have Allen Lazard coming off of an incredible Sunday Night Football game in which he had 6 catches for 75 yards, a touchdown, 17.9 fantasy points, had a couple rushing yards here and there. Of course, Marquez Valdez-Scantling could have scored a touchdown, wasn't able to do so, but at least Allen Lazard picked up the scraps, became the number 2 wide receiver of that offense last night, and was able to deliver a performance that maybe could consistently kind of build over the upcoming weeks. We know Aaron Rodgers dealing with a little bit of an injury there, kind of re-aggravated it last night. Hopefully that's not going to hold him out for any due time, because Allen Lazard is certainly going to need a stable quarterback at the position to have any sort of fantasy value going forward. Moving on to number 10, Laquon Treadwell. Again, I mentioned it every single week here for the last 3 weeks. It seems like Laquon Treadwell is going to be the number 1 wide receiver of this offense in terms of fantasy that we can trust. Laviska Shenault and Marvin Jones Jr. have been far too inconsistent this season in order to kind of trust on a weekly basis. So if in fact you are looking for someone to play against the Houston Texans secondary, of course we just saw this last week. Tyler Lockett have himself a great game. That doesn't immediately transfer to Laviska Shenault, considering he plays a slot position, to have a great game. But I think Laquon Treadwell, getting the targets that he has seen as of late, and the amount of points sitting around 8 to 9 fantasy points per game and a half PPR scoring format, if he continues to produce that, eventually he may have some wide receiver 3 upside with a touchdown. Moving on, we have our number 11 and 12, both from the same team. Josh Palmer and Jalen Guyton, both of them scored over 15 fantasy points yesterday against the New York Giants. The reason why I wanted to mention both these players, if in fact we're in a scenario in which Keenan Allen does not play on Thursday Night Football against the Kansas City Chiefs, then of course Josh Palmer would go ahead and, in my opinion, be a top 5 pickup at the wide receiver position this week alone, because he is serving that slot receiver role. Had himself 7 targets, 5 catches, 66 yards, and a touchdown. Ran a quick 10-yard out, walked into the end zone practically. And of course, the way that Justin Herbert's been playing as late, no matter who is at the wide receiver position, they are benefiting, which is exactly why we then bring up Jalen Guyton, who caught himself a 60-yard bomb for a touchdown. This is back-to-back weeks in which he is getting an incredible amount of fantasy value because of the arm strength and accuracy of Justin Herbert, who continues to air it out to him. I think both these guys have incredible value if, in fact, Keenan Allen is missing. If Keenan Allen is active, then, of course, they sit at number 11 and 12, and we continue to progress through the week. All right, let's go ahead and let's progress to the next position here, talking about tight ends. Our number 1 of the week at the tight end position is Austin Hooper. We talked about him as a hidden gem with David Njoku and Harrison Bryant both out last week. Of course, he was able to score a touchdown, 11.5 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. And as we progress this upcoming week, they do take on the Las Vegas Raiders. It is one of the easiest matchups at the tight end position. If you benefited from him last week, that's fantastic. You'll once again have his services this week. And if, in fact, David Njoku and Harrison Bryant are once again out, his overall upside continues to rise on a weekly basis. Moving on, we have Gerald Everett as our number 2, currently rostered in 31% of leagues. Came back, even though he had a negative point performance the week prior against the San Francisco 49ers, had himself 9.8 fantasy points, scored a touchdown. Again, a lot of people have to look at the amount of targets he continues to get and the amount of relevancy he has found down in the red zone. He scored a couple touchdowns since the return of Russell Wilson. And as long as this offense continues to have him on the field, of course, we have to remember who their offensive coordinator is. Former offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams brought over Gerald Everett as one of his favorite targets in order to help Russell Wilson. I think Everett continues to be a mainstay value in this Seattle Seahawks offense. Moving on to our final tight end option, we have Brevin Jordan, the rookie tight end, who, this last week had himself 10.6 fantasy points, scored a touchdown, 4 catches on 7 targets for 26 yards. He's currently rostered in 0% of leagues. And I'm not surprised, because typically you don't want to roster anybody on the Houston Texans, because then that's at a desperate situation, unless it's perhaps Brandon Cooks. But I want to go ahead and let it be known. The last time Davis Mills started for the Houston Texans was in Week 8 against the Los Angeles Rams. In that game, Brevin Jordan also had 10-plus fantasy points, also scored a touchdown. Davis Mills and him, this rookie connection continues to build every single week. Taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars this week, there's a possibility Jordan could have himself continual value. Moving on to our quarterback conversation. Tua Tagovailoa coming off of the bye week, 32% roster, taking on the New York Jets. A couple stats that I wanted to mention via Tua. Of course, 3 consecutive games of an 80+% passing completion percentage has been the best in the National Football League over the last 3 weeks, weeks 11, 12, and 13 in which he was active. Of course, in those 3 weeks, 17.5 points against the New York Jets, 13.2 against the Carolina Panthers, and 17.8 against the New York Giants. Since he has pretty much taken the quarterback position back from Jacoby Brissett, obviously when he was dealing with a little bit of an injury there, he has been a top 15 quarterback on a weekly basis. And as long as he continues to be the starter here, they're probably going to have to throw the ball even more this week against the Jets. I think Tua has incredible value. Moving on to Jimmy Garoppolo, our number 2. Jimmy Garoppolo has had himself a couple good weeks here as well. In 6 out of the last 7 games, he has had 2 or more touchdowns. He's averaging 17.69 fantasy points per game through that span of time of the last 7 weeks. As long as Jimmy Garoppolo continues to have these incredible matchups, which he does, he has one of the easiest schedules going into the NFL playoffs, taking on the Atlanta Falcons this week. His 30% rostership percentage is going to increase, and perhaps he may be having himself in your starting lineups. We'll just have to wait and see. Either way, he's been a consistent overall quarterback play with Deebo Samuel back the way that George Kittle has been playing as of late. This offense continues to turn out great performances from Jimmy G. Moving on to Big Ben Roethlisberger, our final quarterback option here. We have him mentioned because though he is not rostered in very many percentage of leagues, he's been playing well as of late. Week 11, 13, and 14, he had 22.9 fantasy points against the Chargers, had 19.34 against the Baltimore Ravens, and 24.82 against the Minnesota Vikings. Whenever this man is on fire, he's going to continue to light it up, but it's a matter of whether or not he's going to be able to do so against the Tennessee Titans defense, who has been one of the better in the National Football League. Either way, I think Big Ben has himself a pretty decent chance of performing well this week. Just wanted to mention him. A couple other names I wanted to mention at the quarterback position. If Taysom Hill is available in your league, obviously he's a pickup. For some reason, he's still only rostered in 50% of Yahoo leagues. I'm going to assume 50% of leagues are just sleep. And people are just not playing in those leagues anymore, and they're bots. So for those of us who are active and playing, and he's still available in your league, he needs to be rostered. He's coming off of 2 rushing touchdowns, 70 rushing yards. I mean, dude, just his rushing stats alone makes him a QB1, much less everything he's going to do through the air, especially considering he takes on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week. Josh Allen just ran for over-under on them. Either way, we'll talk about that more later this week. Another option, if you are desperate enough, Davis Mills takes on Jacksonville. Currently rostered in only 2% of leagues. I just wanted to go ahead and mention, this season, he's played pretty well against some pretty good defenses. This last week in Seattle, 18 fantasy points. In Week 8 against Los Angeles Rams, 20.4 fantasy points. And against the New England Patriots in Week 5, 24.68. He's had himself great games. Maybe perhaps he can do it once again against the Jacksonville Jaguars. All right, let's move on to our defense/special team section of Week 15, beginning with the Miami Dolphins. Again, the Miami Dolphins, they take on the New York Jets. The New York Jets are in shambles. In my opinion, of course, besides the fact that the Miami Dolphins are coming off of a bye week and perhaps someone dropped them in your league, this defense is a must start because from weeks 9 through 13, they've been averaging 14.4 fantasy points per game in a standard league. I mean, the stats that they have compiled over that span of time, they've only been allowing 11 points per game to opposing offenses. They've had 19 sacks, 8 interceptions, 3 fumble recoveries, and 2 defensive touchdowns from weeks 9 through 13. As long as this team continues to play as well as they have, taking on the New York Jets, I think there's a very good chance the Miami Dolphins defense has himself another great week here. Moving on to the Philadelphia Eagles coming off of the bye. From weeks 8 through 13, they've been averaging 9.5 fantasy points per game as a defense. They're currently only rostered in 19% of leagues, and they take on the Washington football team, who, without Terry McLaurin, will be, struggling in terms of passing the ball. And of course, the way that the Philadelphia Eagles have played in terms of stopping the run as of late, Antonio Gibson may have his hands full as well, especially with J.D. McKissic coming back. Either way, Philadelphia, not a bad option. But on the other side of this matchup, like I mentioned, the Washington football team, they will be taking on the Philadelphia Eagles, currently rostered only 26% of leagues, coming off of a 14-point fantasy day against the Dallas Cowboys, which they were able to get themselves a defensive touchdown. And perhaps, if this is a lower scoring matchup between these two teams, both could be relevant fantasy defenses. Now that we've talked about defenses, let's transition To the kicker position, beginning with Evan McPherson. Again, every week I pretty much mention him. Currently only rostered in 26% of leagues. Takes on the Denver Broncos. Again, when you play in Denver, the ball can travel even further. But since week 11, Evan McPherson's been averaging 12.75 fantasy points per game, nearly 13 fantasy points per game. He is tied with the most 50-plus yard field goals this season in the National Football League. Of course, big leg, big points. You can get 5 points there in a standard league. Out of a 50-yard field goal, we'll take it from Evan McPherson. Moving on to Jake Elliott, another one of these stud kickers who has, kind of been undervalued as of late. Currently only rostered in 11% of leagues. He's been averaging 12.17 fantasy points per game since week 8. Not only that, since week 8, he has made a total of 15 field goals. Yes, he's had 2 performances of less than 6 fantasy points, but the other performances have always been more than about 15 points. In 4 out of the last 6 weeks. If you can get him on an on week here against the Washington football team defense, then by all means, you could have a great fantasy point kicker that may be able to produce more than your RB2. Moving on to Jason Sanders, the final kicker option I wanted to mention, taking on the New York Jets. Only rostered in 10% of leagues. He has scored 10 plus fantasy points in 3 out of the last 4 games that he has played. And that's pretty much it. Those are our kickers. Again, if Nick Folk was dropped in your league, again, he is the current #1 kicker in fantasy football for the New England Patriots. If he's available, go ahead and pick him up. But I just wanted to mention players that probably haven't been dropped and are most likely available in your respective leagues. These are our Week 15 waiver wire targets for the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I appreciate the support. If you haven't yet already, subscribe to the channel. Click the like button down below. And, of course, tomorrow we'll be talking about our Week 15 running back rankings. Of course, rankings are subject to change, but be sure to check that out. Enjoy tonight's game. Let me know what you need to happen. Pray to the fantasy gods that Kyler Murray, D-Hop, Sony Michel, Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp are able to get you into the playoffs if you have not yet already clinched that. Either way, also check out Underdog Fantasy. You can play in tonight's contest by drafting a team and perhaps winning thousands of dollars. Check that out. Use promo code Andrew today. Link is down in the description. Again, thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.